He didn't stop to think. He didn't weigh the odds or calculate what it might cost him. When the shot cracked through the air, and a little girl in a yellow dress stood frozen in the middle of a screaming crowd alone, abandoned, too small to understand what was hunting, her Callum Stroud moved. Not because he had to, not because anyone was watching, but because something in him, something buried and scarred and long since silenced, recognized that moment for exactly what it was, the kind that doesn't give you a second chance if you flinch. He crossed that mall in 6 seconds. He took the hit in 7. And 3 minutes later, the little girl's mother arrived, and nothing about what came next went the way anyone expected. If stories like this one move you stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it counts the most, please subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss what's coming next. The Hartwell Mall on a Saturday afternoon was exactly the kind of place Callum Stroud would have chosen to avoid if he'd had any other option. It was loud in the particular way that upscale shopping centers manage to be loud, not the honest noise of a street market or a crowded bus terminal, but a manufactured kind of bustle, all polished floors and recirculated air, and the faint smell of cinnamon from a bakery stand near the main entrance. Families pushed strollers. Teenagers drifted in clusters. Somewhere near the fountain, a child was shrieking with laughter, the sound bouncing off the glass ceiling 3 stories above. Callum walked 2 steps behind his son and tried not to think about how much his feet hurt. 8-year-old Emmett had been talking for approximately 40 minutes without stopping. This was not unusual. Emmett had inherited his late mother's gift for sustained conversation and her complete indifference to whether the other person was keeping up. He was currently explaining, in significant detail, why the sneakers in the window of the sporting goods store they'd just passed were not only superior to the sneakers he was currently wearing, but were in fact necessary to his continued happiness. The soul is different, Dad. It's not just style, it's engineering. It's $89. It's an investment. You're 8. I'm almost 9. Callum looked at him. Emmett looked back with the particular expression he'd been perfecting, since around age 6, part innocence, part calculation, entirely too effective on a man who didn't sleep enough and couldn't say no as cleanly as he wanted to. We'll see, Callum said. Emmett accepted this as the partial victory it was and immediately began talking about something else. They were heading toward the food court because Callum had promised lunch before the sneaker conversation began, and because he'd skipped breakfast again and could feel it in the low-grade ache behind his eyes. He'd worked the late shift at the warehouse Thursday night, then again Friday, and his body was still carrying the debt from those hours, the dull weight in his lower back, the stiffness in his knees that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with concrete floors and boxes that didn't get lighter the more you moved them. He was 37 years old. Some mornings he felt 20 years past that. The food court occupied the entire east wing of the mall's ground floor, a wide open space ringed with restaurant counters and crowded with plastic tables. The lunch rush was thinning out, but it was still busy enough that Callum had to navigate around a family with a double stroller and a pair of elderly men who'd turned 2 chairs into a chess match. He was scanning for an open table when he first noticed the girl. Yellow dress, floral pattern. She was maybe 7, maybe 8, standing absolutely still near the edge of the food court while the crowd moved around her like water around a stone. She held an ice cream cone in both hands, chocolate. From the look of it, and the ice cream was melting in the afternoon heat, dripping over her fingers. She didn't seem to notice. She was staring at a point in the middle distance with the specific blankness of a child who has crossed the line from nervous into something worse. Callum saw her and felt something shift in his chest. Not alarm, exactly. Just attention. The same involuntary recalibration that happened whenever something didn't sit right in his environment, a sensation he'd spent years trying to train himself out of and had largely failed. Emmett, he said. Hold on a second. What, Dad? The pizza place is he in? 1 second. He was watching the girl, watching the crowd around her, watching for the adult who should have been beside her and wasn't. Then the sound hit. It wasn't close. It came from the direction of the main atrium, a sharp crack that landed wrong against the ambient noise, too hard and too short, and followed immediately by a second, and then by the specific quality of silence that only exists in the half-second before a crowd realizes what it's hearing. Callum's hand found Emmett's shoulder before he consciously decided to reach for it. Then the screaming started, and the food court became chaos. People lurched away from the sound, moving fast and without direction, tables scattering, chairs going over, voices rising into something shapeless and panicked. A woman near the burger counter dropped her tray. The elderly chess players were on their feet. The family with the double stroller was trying to turn against the current of the crowd and failing. Callum pulled Emmett close, put a pillar at their backs, and looked. Not at the exits, not at the crowd. He looked for the threats and the patterns. Most people run from the sound of gunfire. They move toward open space, toward exits, toward anything that feels like escape. The sound had come from the atrium, which meant the flow of panicking people was pouring east into the food court, and anyone who needed to be moving west against that flow was doing it either because they were security or because they were the threat. The girl in the yellow dress was still standing in the same spot. She was crying now, silently, the kind of crying that happens when a child is too frightened to produce sound, just tears running down her face, while she held the ruined ice cream cone and turned in a slow, helpless circle. And there was a man moving toward her, dark hoodie, hood up, despite the climate-controlled air, moving with the kind of deliberate calm that looked wrong against the backdrop of everyone else's panic, not running, not retreating, not looking for family or exits, moving through the crowd the way someone moves when they've already decided on a destination. His right hand was inside his hoodie pocket. It had been 12 years since Callum Stroud carried a weapon in any official capacity. 12 years since he'd operated in environments where stillness meant something was about to go badly wrong. He'd buried all of it carefully, methodically. In the years after Emmett was born, packed it down under warehouse shifts and rent calculations, and the business of being a father who showed up and stayed. But the body doesn't forget. "Stay here," he said to Emmett. "Behind this pillar. Don't move. Do you hear me?" Emmett looked up at him with wide eyes. "Dad, do you hear me?" "Yes." Callum moved. He angled through the crowd against the grain the same way the man in the hoodie was moving, using the panicking flow around him to mask his approach. He kept his eyes on the girl and on the man, measuring distance, measuring timing, the old geometry of threat assessment coming back clean and cold, as if no time had passed at all. The man was maybe 15 feet from her. Callum was 20 from both of them. He pushed through a gap between two overturned chairs, stepped around a teenage girl who was crouched on the floor with her arms over her head, and then another shot cracked from somewhere overhead, a second shooter. Different position, and the crowd's panic doubled, and for 2 seconds, the space between Callum and the girl filled with bodies trying to run. He went through them, not gently. He took an elbow to the jaw from a man who didn't know he was there, staggered half a step and kept moving. He reached the girl at the same moment the man in the hoodie did. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds and would later be difficult to explain in any way that made sense to people who hadn't been there. Callum put himself between the girl and the man. He swept her sideways with his left arm, pulling her off her feet, turning his body to take whatever came. Something slammed into his right arm high on the bicep, enough to knock him back a step. He went down with the girl, taking the fall on his left shoulder, covering her with his body as best he could. The man in the hoodie kept moving. He didn't stop. He didn't fire again. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, moving fast now, hood still up, swallowed by the chaos inside of 3 seconds. Callum lay on the food court floor with a frightened child pressed against his chest and a burning, spreading pain in his right arm that he catalogued with the distant precision of someone who has been hurt enough times to know how to rank it. Not the bone. Muscle damage, possibly the outer edge of something more but functional. He could move the arm. He'd hurt it, rather than the reverse. The girl was making a sound against his shirt, not words. Just a high continuous note of terror. "Hey," he said. His voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "Hey, I've got you. You're okay. I've got you." She grabbed his shirt with both fists and held on. He looked up. The food court was still in motion, people streaming for exits, but the immediate area had cleared somewhat. He could see Emmett behind the pillar, where he'd told him to stay white-faced, rigid with fear, but staying. Good kid. He sat up carefully, keeping his right arm pressed against his side. The sleeve was dark. He didn't look at it directly. "What's your name?" he asked the girl. She pulled back enough to look at him. Her eyes were brown. Her face was streaked with tears and a thin smear of chocolate ice cream. "Tessa," she whispered. "Tessa. I'm Callum. Is anyone with you?" "My mom." Her voice broke on the second word. She went to get napkins. She said she'd be right back. "Okay," he said. "She's coming back. She's looking for you right now." He had no way of knowing if that was true. He said it because the child needed to hear it, and because he'd spent 8 years learning that sometimes the most important thing you can do for a frightened person is hand them something to believe while they wait. He got to his feet slowly, pulling Tessa up with him, keeping her close. He looked for his son. Emmett, come here. Emmett came fast, his face doing that thing where he was trying to look calm and not quite managing it. He stopped short when he saw his father's arm. You're bleeding. I know, that's a lot. I know, Emmett. Dad. I'm standing up. I'm talking to you. I'm fine for now. Callum looked at him steadily until the panic behind Emmett's eyes settled into something more manageable. I need you to hold her hand. Her name is Tessa. She's scared and she's lost, same as you'd be. Can you do that? Emmett looked at the girl in the yellow dress. Something shifted in his expression, the particular seriousness that showed up in him sometimes, the part that surprised Callum even after all these years. Yeah, Emmett said. He reached over and took Tessa's hand. Tessa let him. By then the shooting had stopped. Whatever had happened in the atrium was over, or had moved somewhere else, and the mall was beginning to transition from active panic into the stunned stillness that follows. Callum could hear sirens outside. Security personnel were appearing at the entrances, too late for anything useful but appearing. He kept them where they were, near the pillar, away from the traffic of people still streaming for exits. His arm had settled into a steady, deep throb. He pressed his forearm against his ribs to keep the bleeding at a manageable rate and tried to think about what to do next. He was thinking about whether to move toward an exit or stay put for emergency services when he heard her. Not words, at first, just a voice, cutting through the ambient noise with a quality that Callum recognized instantly, the absolute zero of a parent who doesn't know where their child is. Tessa, Tessa. The girl's head snapped up. Mom! The woman came through the thinning crowd at something close to a run. She was younger than Callum had expected, maybe 30, maybe a year or two either side of it. Dark hair pulled back without particular attention. She wore a silk blouse that had probably cost more than Callum made in a week. But she was wearing it the way someone wears clothes when they put them on that morning without thinking, because they had 23 other things on their mind. She was carrying a small purse and nothing else, and her face was doing exactly what Callum's face had done when he'd scanned the area for Emmett, and couldn't immediately see him a controlled surface over something that was anything but. She reached Tessa and dropped to her knees on the food court floor without hesitation, wrapping her arms around the girl, pulling her in. For a moment she didn't say anything. Neither did Tessa. Emmett let go of the girl's hand and quietly stepped back. Callum watched and didn't say anything either. When the woman pulled back to look at her daughter, she was checking her the way parents check children, after a scare hands moving quickly over arms, face, checking for damage, cataloging. Are you hurt, Tessa? Look at me. Are you hurt anywhere? No, Tessa said. He got me. He grabbed me down. The woman looked up. She found Callum in the way that people find the thing their attention has been circling without landing on all at once, slightly startled. Her eyes took him in, the pressed arm, the dark sleeve, the fact that he was still standing without apparent difficulty while clearly not being entirely fine. You're bleeding, she said. So I've been told, Callum said. Something moved across her face. Not softness, exactly. More like recalibration. She was alone. You stayed with her. She needed someone to stay with her. The woman stood. She was a few inches shorter than him, and she had the kind of posture that came from rooms where you were always expected to take up the right amount of space. She looked at his arm again, then at his face. I'm Arden Wycliffe, she said. Callum Stroud, Mr. Stroud. She paused. The crowd was thinning around them. Emergency personnel were coming through the east entrance now, and the sirens outside had multiplied. You're going to need medical attention. That wound. I'm aware. We should get you. I just need to get my son home, Callum said. Not rudely, just plainly. He's had a rough afternoon. Arden Wycliffe looked at Emmett, who was standing a careful distance away, with his hands shoved in his pockets and his eyes on the floor, in the specific way that meant he was listening to every word. She looked back at Callum. What hospital? She asked. Excuse me? Which hospital do you want to go to? I'll have someone arrange, Miss Wycliffe. He said it evenly. I appreciate it. I don't need anything. For a moment she looked like she was going to push back. Then she didn't.
Really, Callum said.
I'm going to take Emmett and go. I'm glad your daughter is okay. He meant it. He could see it in Tessa's face, the color coming back, the grip on her mother's sleeve loosening now that she had what she'd needed. The kid was going to be fine. That was enough. He collected Emmett with a look, and they walked toward the exit, Callum's arm pressed against his side, his son quiet beside him for the first time all afternoon. Behind him, he heard Arden Wycliffe say something to her daughter in a low voice. He didn't hear what. He didn't look back. Outside, the afternoon sun hit the parking lot hard and flat. Emmett walked beside him in silence for almost a full minute, which was a personal record, and then said, without looking up, "Does it really hurt?" "Yes," Callum said. "You should have told her we needed the hospital." "We'll manage." Emmett was quiet again for a few steps. "Dad." "Yeah, that man was going to hurt her. It wasn't a question." Callum looked down at his son. Emmett was staring at the ground ahead of them, jaw set, 8 years old and already carrying something heavier than he should have had to. "Yeah," Callum said. "But she's okay now, she's okay." Emmett nodded, said nothing else. They found the car in the third row of the parking structure, exactly where they'd left it. Callum opened the passenger door, let Emmett get in, and then stood for a moment on the driver's side with one hand on the roof. His arm was throbbing in a long, steady rhythm. His hands were perfectly steady. The afternoon sun threw hard shadows across the concrete. He thought about the man in the dark hoodie, the way he'd moved, the way he'd looked at the girl not randomly, not desperately, directly. He thought about that for several seconds. Then he got in the car, started the engine, and drove home with his son. The urgent care clinic on Dalton Street smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and the waiting room chairs were the specific shade of orange that suggested someone had made a purchasing decision in 1987 and never revisited it. Callum sat in one of them with his right sleeve cut open and a wad of gauze pressed against his arm, while a nurse named Dolores filled out paperwork with the methodical patience of someone who had seen considerably worse on a Saturday afternoon and wasn't particularly impressed by any of it. Emmett sat 2 chairs away, eating crackers from a vending machine packet and pretending to be fine. Callum watched him do it and didn't say anything. The wound turned out to be a graze deep enough to need cleaning and closure, not deep enough to qualify as the emergency. Emmett had clearly been catastrophizing in the car. The bullet had caught the outer edge of Callum's right bicep and kept going, which was the best possible outcome for a situation that had no genuinely good outcomes. The doctor, a tired man in his 50s named Prakash, who smelled faintly of cigarettes and moved with the efficiency of someone 20 minutes behind schedule, put in 8 stitches and told Callum to keep the arm elevated and come back if it started showing signs of infection. "You're lucky," Dr. Prakash said, tying off the last stitch. "People keep telling me that," Callum said. "You were in the Hartwell shooting?" "We were nearby." Dr. Prakash looked at him over the edge of his glasses with the expression of a man who had decided not to ask follow-up questions. "Well, 8 stitches and a tetanus booster. Could have been a lot worse." "I know. Insurance card?" Callum handed it over. Watched the doctor's face do the small, involuntary thing faces do when they look at substandard coverage and decide not to comment on it. Callum had seen that expression from doctors, from school administrators, from the leasing office manager when he'd first applied for their apartment. He was used to it. It didn't sting the way it once had. It was just part of the architecture of his life, the same as the orange chairs and the cost of Emmett's school supplies and the fact that the car needed new rear tires, and he was going to have to decide which bill to delay in order to cover them. He thought about Arden Wycliffe's silk blouse and the way she'd said, "We'll have someone arrange it." The way people say things when arranging things is simply what happens, as naturally as breathing. He thought about it, and then he stopped thinking about it, because it wasn't useful. They got home at 7:15. Callum made dinner from what was in the refrigerator: eggs, leftover rice, half a block of cheddar that was close enough to its end date that he used the whole thing rather than risk it, and they ate at the kitchen table while the news played on the small television he kept on the counter. The Hartwell Mall shooting was the lead story on every local channel. 2 gunmen. 3 people injured, none critically. 1 gunman in custody, 1 still at large. Mall security footage being reviewed. Police asking for witnesses to come forward. Emmett watched the screen with his fork halfway to his mouth and said, "Is that why you did it? Because you knew there were 2 of them?" "I didn't know anything," Callum said. "I saw a man moving toward a little girl who was alone, and it looked wrong. But you weren't scared." Callum thought about the true answer to that question. I don't know if scared is the right word. My brain was working. There wasn't room for scared. "That sounds like scared," Emmett said. "Maybe," Callum said. "Eat your eggs." Emmett ate his eggs. After a minute he said, without looking up, "She had chocolate ice cream all over her hands." "When I was holding her hand." I didn't say anything because it seemed rude. Callum looked at his son. That was the right call, he said. Emmett shrugged like it was nothing, and Callum turned back to his plate so the kid wouldn't see his face do something embarrassing. He slept badly that night. Not because of the arm, though the arm contributed. The local anesthetic had worn off around 10, and the stitched-up muscle made itself known every time he shifted position. It was the other thing. The replay that ran on a loop behind his eyes whether he wanted it to or not. The man in the hoodie, the angle of movement, the specific deliberateness of it. 2 gunmen in the mall, one of whom had been moving through a panicked crowd against the flow, directly toward a specific child. That wasn't random. He turned that thought over several times in the dark and didn't like it any better from different angles. By Sunday morning, he'd mostly convinced himself it was a coincidence. By Sunday evening, he was less sure. By Monday, he'd stopped trying to convince himself of anything, because Monday was when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end identified itself as belonging to a man named Sterling Kessler, Chief of Security for Wycliffe Technologies. Mr. Stroud, the man said. He had the kind of voice that implied it had been trained to project authority and had been doing so for long enough that it had forgotten how to do anything else. I'd like to arrange a meeting. At your earliest convenience. Callum was in the parking lot of the warehouse 40 minutes before his shift started, eating a sandwich from the gas station across the street. About what? About Saturday's incident at Hartwell Mall. We'd like to speak with you in person. The police already took my statement. We're not the police, Mr. Stroud. I know who you are, Callum said. What is it you actually want? A brief pause. The kind of pause that gets inserted when someone adjusts their approach. Ms. Wycliffe would like to thank you properly for what you did for her daughter. She would also like to ensure that the situation doesn't become more complicated than it needs to be. Callum chewed his sandwich, more complicated. Situations like this tend to attract attention. Media attention in particular. It's in everyone's interest to manage the narrative carefully. I haven't talked to any reporters. We know. We'd like to keep it that way. Callum looked at the warehouse entrance across the lot and thought about the shift ahead. 8 hours of moving inventory in a building that wasn't properly climate controlled. His arm was going to make that difficult. His supervisor was probably already annoyed that he'd called in Sunday. Fine, he said. When? They sent a car Tuesday morning. Callum hadn't asked for a car. He'd planned to drive himself, but when he came downstairs at 8:40 and found a black sedan idling at the curb with a driver who got out and opened the rear door without being asked, he understood that this was the kind of meeting where details were managed before they could become inconveniences. He got in the car. He did not particularly enjoy the experience. Wycliffe Technologies occupied the top 12 floors of a glass tower in the financial district. The lobby was the kind of space that said money in the specific way that means we don't need to prove it to you, minimal, precise, with a reception desk made of something that probably had a name Callum didn't know. The woman behind it had his name on a list and issued him a visitor badge with the frictionless efficiencies of a system that had been thought through completely. Sterling Kessler met him at the elevator bank on the 31st floor. He was taller than his voice had suggested, mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of fitness that looked maintained rather than natural. He had military in him somewhere. Callum clocked it immediately from the posture and the handshake, though which branch and how long ago were harder to read. He was wearing a suit that fit precisely and a watch that cost more than Callum's monthly rent. And he was smiling in the way that people smile when they want to appear warmer than they actually intend to be. Mr. Stroud, thank you for coming. He extended a hand. Callum shook it. Mr. Kessler, Sterling, please. Come this way. He was led into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. A woman Callum didn't recognize sat at one end of the table, a legal pad in front of her. 2 other men in the room, Callum read them as corporate security, not just from the earpieces, but from the specific way they'd positioned themselves near the secondary exit. Arden Wycliffe was not in the room. Callum sat where he was directed to sit and waited. Sterling settled across from him and opened a folder. Actually opened a folder, the physical kind, with printed pages inside. Callum looked at the top page and recognized the format without being able to read the content from where he was sitting. We appreciate your discretion over the past few days, Sterling said. Handling something like this quietly is always preferable for everyone involved. I wasn't being discreet, Callum said. I just didn't have anything to say. Of course, Sterling smiled again. Mr. Stroud, I want to be transparent with you. as part of our standard protocol in situations involving potential security threats to Ms. Wycliffe or her family. We conduct preliminary background assessments on any individuals who come into significant contact with them. Callum held very still. You ran a background check on me. A preliminary one. Entirely standard. I saved your employer's daughter's life. And we're grateful for that. Enormously. Sterling didn't look even slightly uncomfortable. We're also a responsible security operation, Mr. Stroud, which means we ask questions. Including questions about the people who enter our principal's orbit under unexpected circumstances. Callum looked at him for a moment. What did you want to know? Your military service record shows 4 years enlisted, and then a period of roughly 6 years in which the details become significantly harder to verify. Sterling let that land. Difficult to verify is a phrase we take seriously in this business. I'm sure you do. Your response at the mall by several eyewitness accounts, including our own review of the security footage, was not consistent with the behavior of a civilian bystander. The speed of identification, the tactical movement through the crowd, the way you placed your body. Those are trained responses, Mr. Stroud. Maybe I've seen a lot of action movies. No smile from Sterling this time. I think you understand what I'm getting at. I think you're asking me to explain myself to you, Callum said. When I don't work for you, I'm not under investigation for anything. And the only thing I actually did on Saturday was stop a man from reaching a child. Silence in the conference room. The woman with the legal pad was writing something. We'd like you to sign a confidentiality agreement, Sterling said. Standard language. Limits discussion of your contact with Ms. Wycliffe and her family, protects everyone's privacy. I'm not signing anything, Mr. Stroud. I'm not a reporter. I'm not planning to sell a story. I have a kid and a job, and I'd like to go back to both of them. Callum put his hands flat on the table. Is there something else? Or is that actually why you brought me in here? Sterling opened his mouth, and then the conference room door opened. Arden Wycliffe walked in. She was dressed differently than she'd been at the mall, tailored jacket. Dark slacks, the kind of put together that came from having a schedule and the infrastructure to support it. Her hair was down. She looked like she'd slept better than Callum had, though there was something around her eyes that suggested it hadn't been entirely easy. She stopped when she saw him, and something crossed her face that was gone before Callum could fully read it. Mr. Stroud. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat without ceremony. You look better than the last time I saw you. Lower bar, he said. A corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Sterling, can you give us a few minutes? Sterling looked like he wanted to say several things. He said none of them. Of course. He stood, collected his folder, and left. The two men near the exit followed. The woman with the legal pad hesitated, and Arden said, You too, Rachel, without looking at her. Then they were alone in the conference room, with the city spread out 31 floors below them. Arden looked at Callum for a moment. He looked back at her. Neither of them rushed it. He's thorough, Arden said, meaning Sterling. He's suspicious of a warehouse worker who happened to be in the wrong place, Callum said. That's different. You were a SEAL. The word landed flat. Callum didn't react to it. My file says I served, he said. It says you served, and then it stopped saying anything useful for about 6 years. She leaned back in her chair. Sterling's not wrong that your response at the mall wasn't civilian behavior. I was there. I saw the security footage. You'd already seen it before today. Yes. So the meeting with Sterling first was what, a test? To see if I'd sign something or make noise about it. Arden held his gaze. It was protocol. For who? For me or for you? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, a plane crossed the sky at altitude, a silver line against blue. What do you want, Mr. Stroud? She said. Nothing from you, he said. It came out more blunt than he'd intended, but he left it where it landed. I told you that at the mall. I wanted to take Emmett home, and I did. You called me here. I wanted to thank you properly. You're welcome. And I wanted to offer to cover your medical expenses. The full cost, not just what's your insurance. She blinked. Not surprised exactly. More like she'd expected pushback, but not this fast. Mr. Stroud, you were injured while protecting my daughter. The least I made a choice, Callum said. Nobody hired me to make it, and nobody owes me for it. That's not me being proud. That's just what happened. Arden studied him in the way that people study things they haven't entirely figured out yet. Callum got the sense she didn't encounter many things she hadn't entirely figured out. Then at least let Tessa thank you, she said. She's been asking about you. That one caught him slightly off guard. He thought about the girl in the yellow dress. the way she'd grabbed his shirt with both fists. The chocolate ice cream smeared across her knuckles. "She's okay?" he asked. "She's working through it," Ardson said. The careful phrasing of someone who had learned to manage what they reveal about things that matter. "She had some bad nights. She'll be fine. A beat. She wants to know if you have a son." Emmett told her about himself while she was holding his hand, Callum said. Arden almost smiled. "He sounds like a good kid." "He is." Callum picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and stood. "Ms. Wycliffe, I appreciate the gesture. I don't need the money. I'm not going to talk to reporters, and I don't need Sterling Kessler making calls to my employer to verify I am who I say I am." Arden sat up straight. "Sterling contacted your employer?" The reaction was fast enough and genuine enough that Callum paused. "Someone did," he said. "Monday. My supervisor pulled me aside and said someone had been making inquiries. A muscle worked in Arden's jaw. I didn't authorize that. Maybe not. But it happened." She looked at the closed conference room door for a moment with the specific expression of someone updating a mental file. "I'll look into it." "I'd appreciate that," Callum said. "Because I've been on reduced hours since Sunday, and those shifts are how I keep Emmett fed." He said it without anger, without performance. Just the plain math of it, laid out between them in a room where the furniture probably cost more than he made in a month. Arden held his gaze and didn't look away from it, and Callum gave her credit for that. "I'll take care of it," she said. He nodded, picked up his jacket. "Then we're good." He was at the door when she said, "Mr. Stroud." He turned. Arden was still seated, both hands flat on the table. She looked, for the first time since she'd walked in, like she was about to say something she hadn't planned. "What you did, what it cost you, I don't have the right framework for that. I don't know how to." She stopped, recalibrated. "I misjudged you. From the beginning. I want you to know I understand that." Callum stood in the doorway for a moment. "You were scared for your kid," he said. "People make bad calls when they're scared for their kid. I know that better than most." He didn't wait for an answer. He rode the elevator down alone, returned his visitor badge to the receptionist, and walked out into the city. The morning air was cool enough to cut through his jacket. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the glass tower. He thought about Sterling Kessler and his folder and his conference room full of carefully positioned people. He thought about the questions nobody had directly asked, what Lee asked, what he'd actually done during those 6 years, and why someone with his background was now working nights in a warehouse, and whether that was his problem to explain to anyone. It wasn't. He started walking toward the parking garage where he'd left the car. His phone rang. Unknown number. Different one than before. He almost didn't answer. He picked up because he'd developed over the years a mild superstition about not answering unknown numbers every time he'd ignored one. It had turned out to matter. "Stroud," he said. Silence for a half second. Then, "Mr. Stroud, my name is Detective Vanessa Ortega. I'm with the Hartwell Investigative Task Force. Do you have a few minutes?" He stopped walking. "What's this about?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. "The shooting at the mall Saturday," Detective Ortega said. "Specifically, the individual you physically intervened with near the food court. We've had a chance to review the security footage, and Mr. Stroud, the man you stopped, wasn't one of our shooters." Callum stood on the sidewalk with the city moving around him. "Then who was he?" he said. A pause from the other end that told him everything before the detective actually spoke. "That's what we're trying to figure out." He wasn't responding to the shooting. The timing and direction of his movement on camera strongly suggest he was operating independently of the two gunmen. He appears to have been in the mall before the shooting started, and his target based on trajectory was not random. Callum looked back at the glass tower. He was heading for the girl, Callum said. He was heading for a specific location, yes. We're in the process of identifying him. We'd like to talk to you in more detail about what you observed, his movement, his behavior, anything you remember. I'll come in today, Callum said. He spent 2 hours with Detective Ortega and her partner at a district substation that smelled like bad coffee and printer toner. He told them everything he remembered, the angle of approach, the hand in the pocket, the way the man moved differently than everyone else around him. He drew a rough diagram of the food court positioning from memory and was unsurprised to find it accurate when they overlaid it against the security footage stills. Detective Ortega watched him do this with a neutral expression that had a question sitting behind it. "Warehouse work," she said at one point. "Yes," Callum said. She didn't push, but he caught her and her partner exchanging a look that he cataloged and set aside. He drove home with the late afternoon light coming in flat and orange through the windshield. Emmett was at school, wouldn't be home until 4:30. The apartment was quiet, in the specific way that apartments are quiet when you've lived in them long enough that the silence has its own texture. Callum sat at the kitchen table and put his keys down and didn't move for a few minutes. He kept coming back to the same point, rotating around it the way you circle something on a map that doesn't fit the terrain. The shooting had been used as cover. Probably planned that way, create chaos in the mall, deploy someone in the crowd to reach Tessa Wycliffe while everyone was looking at the gunfire. If the timing had been better, if Callum hadn't been standing where he was, if he'd gone for the exit the same as everyone else. He stood up, went to the bedroom, and opened the closet. In the back, behind a garment bag that held a suit he wore to funerals and job interviews, there was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox. Fireproof. The lock on it was a 3-number combination that had been the same for 12 years. He sat on the edge of the bed with the box on his knees. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the specific gravity of a thing that held a period of your life you'd decided to move away from. He'd joined the Navy at 22 with the specific goal of getting somewhere his circumstances hadn't determined for him. He'd gone to Bud SH and come out the other side. He'd spent 6 years doing the kind of work that never got formally named in documents, that left gaps in records, that required a version of yourself you couldn't maintain indefinitely without it becoming the only version that existed. Then Emmett had happened, and his relationship with Emmett's mother had ended before the ink was dry on the hospital discharge, and Callum had made the only decision that felt non-negotiable. He was going to be the father his son actually needed, not a legend in his own head who showed up between deployments and called that close enough. He'd separated. He'd taken Emmett, who was 14 months old, and already displaying opinions about most things. He'd figured out civilian life the same way he'd figured out everything else, by accepting that it would be harder than it looked, and moving forward anyway. The warehouse wasn't what he'd planned. It was what had been available when he'd needed income fast and couldn't wait for a better option. And then it had become what he did while he figured out the better option. And then enough time had passed that the warehouse had simply become the job. The way jobs become the job when you're too busy surviving to step back and evaluate. He wasn't complaining. He knew what the work was worth. He knew it wasn't enough, and he knew the health insurance was inadequate, and he knew Emmett deserved a more stable floor under him, and he carried all of that with the same steadiness he'd carried heavier things. But there were nights, not often, but they existed when he sat in the quiet of the department and felt the particular weight of a set of skills that had no current application. Not because he missed the work. He didn't, or not most of it. But because there is something specifically uncomfortable about being built for something and spending your days doing something else entirely. He opened the box. Inside, a folded set of orders from a deployment that no longer officially existed. A photograph of 6 men in gear in a location he'd never name even now. A coin from the unit worn smooth on one side from handling. A phone number written on a card in handwriting that wasn't his. And underneath all of it, a service record that told approximately 40% of the actual story. He picked up the photograph, held it for a moment, put it back. He closed the box, returned it to the closet, and went to make coffee. His phone rang while the kettle was heating. This time it was a number he recognized his supervisor at the warehouse, a man named Gary, who communicated primarily through sighs and whose default setting was mild disappointment. "Callum," Gary said. "Listen, those questions we got about you." "I'm having it taken care of," Callum said. "Okay," but pause, waited. "Corporate called today. I don't know who your situation involves, but when corporate calls me about an employee, that's not something I can just." "Gary." Callum kept his voice level. "I saved a kid's life at a mall on Saturday. The kid's family has a security department that decided to run a background check on me without authorization. It's being addressed. I need my shifts back." A longer pause. "You saved a kid?" "Yes." "At the Hartwell thing, I saw that on the news." "I wasn't on the news. There was a piece about a bystander who Gary seemed to be doing math." "That was you, Gary." "My shifts, right. Yeah. I'll put you back on starting Thursday." He put his phone down on the counter next to the kettle. Thursday. That was 2 more days of no income at a point in the month when he'd already calculated things down to numbers that didn't allow for surprises. He thought about Arden Wycliffe's offer to cover his medical bills, and then he thought about the 8 stitches in his arm and the copay he'd calculated on the drive home from urgent care. He thought about Emmett's sneakers and the $89 and the word investment delivered with complete sincerity by an 8-year-old who didn't know yet how funny that was. He poured his coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and drank it while the afternoon moved toward evening, and thought about a man in a dark hoodie who had moved through a panicking crowd toward a specific child, deliberately and without hesitation, while two gunmen created the noise that was supposed to cover him. Someone had sent that man. Someone had planned this. And Tessa Wycliffe, 8 years old in a yellow floral dress, had been the target. Callum turned that over in his mind and felt something old and very cold settle in behind his sternum, not fear, not anger, but the particular quality of alertness that had kept him functional in difficult places for the better part of a decade. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished. He rinsed his mug, set it in the drying rack, and went to pick up his son from school. Detective Ortega called Thursday morning, while Callum was lacing up his work boots before his first shift back at the warehouse. "We identified him," she said, without preamble. She had that quality, he'd noticed it, at the substation of someone who considered small talk a courtesy she extended to people she had more time for. The man from the food court. His name is Gerald Foss. 41, former private security contractor, 2 prior arrests, neither of which resulted in conviction. He's got a history of working for hire. Callum sat on the edge of his bed with one boot half-laced. "You have him in custody?" "We did not find him in custody because we have not yet located him," Ortega said. "He's gone. Left his apartment in the 48 hours after the mall incident, and we have not been able to place him since." A brief pause. "Mr. Stroud, the 2 shooters from the main atrium, have both been processed and interviewed. Their operation had nothing to do with Foss. They were there for an unrelated reason, wrong place, wrong timing. Foss used the shooting as opportunistic cover, but he wasn't connected to those 2 men. Someone sent him independently," Callum said. "That's what the evidence suggests. Which means whoever hired Foss was already planning to move on the Wycliffe family before Saturday, and the mall shootings was a coincidence that made their timing look better." Another pause. "I'm telling you this because you were directly involved, and because honestly your read on that situation was faster and more accurate than any of our responding personnel. I thought you should know the picture is bigger than it looked." After he hung up, Callum sat for a moment with his half-laced boot and the information settling around him. A hired contractor, a pre-planned operation, a target who was 8 years old and wore yellow dresses and had chocolate ice cream on her hands. He finished lacing his boot, went to work, and moved boxes for 8 hours, with his arm aching steadily under the bandage, and spent most of those 8 hours trying not to think about what Ortega's phone call meant for the people in that glass tower. He failed at not thinking about it. By the time he picked up Emmett from school that afternoon, he had a headache behind his left eye, and a decision forming that he hadn't fully admitted to himself yet. That evening after dinner, he called the number Ortega had left him and asked her who was coordinating with Wycliffe Technologies' security team. "Sterling Kessler's office has been in contact with us," Ortega said. "How much are you sharing with them?" "The appropriate amount." "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's not." "Why? Because if someone hired a contractor to grab a child from a public mall, and the target is the daughter of a tech company CEO, then the threat is probably connected to something inside that company's world, which means the security team needs to know the full picture." He paused. "Do they know Foss was working independently?" "We briefed Kessler's office yesterday." "How'd he respond?" A longer pause from Ortega. He indicated they would handle it internally and adjust their protocols accordingly. Callum thought about Sterling Kessler and his perfectly fitted suit and his conference room of carefully positioned people. "Okay," he said, "Mr. Stroud." Ortega's voice shifted slightly. "Is there something you want to tell me?" "Not yet," he said. "Maybe later." He didn't sleep much that night either. By the following Monday, Arden had apparently made good on her promise because his supervisor Gary called to apologize an experience that clearly caused Gary some genuine discomfort and confirmed that corporate had retracted whatever inquiry had been made about Callum's employment status. His hours were restored. The situation, Gary said, with the tone of a man who very much did not want to know the details, had been resolved. It was the right thing for Arden to do, and she'd done it. Callum gave her credit for that without spending too long on it. The call he didn't expect came 9 days after the mall incident, on a Tuesday afternoon, from a direct line registered to Wycliffe Technologies. Not Sterling, Arden herself. "I need to ask a favor," she said, which was not the opening he'd anticipated. "What kind of favor?" "Our security team has identified a credible internal threat. Someone has been accessing systems they shouldn't have access to, and we have reason to believe it's connected to the mall incident." Her voice was controlled, but not entirely flat. There was something underneath it, a tension she was keeping banked. We're bringing in the people who were directly involved in Saturday's events to help reconstruct a timeline, including your observations. Kessler's asking for this? A brief pause. I'm asking for it. Callum understood the distinction she was drawing. He thought about the contractor in the dark hoodie and the 8 stitches in his arm, and the way Tessa had grabbed his shirt with both fists on a food court floor. When? He said. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. I'll send a car. I have a car, Callum said. I know, she said, and he could hear that it almost made her smile. He arrived at Wycliffe Technologies at 5 minutes to 9 and was taken not to the conference room on the 31st floor, but to a different space entirely a security operations center on the 29th, which was smaller and considerably less designed to impress than anywhere he'd been in the building before. It had monitors on 3 walls, a central table with multiple workstations, and the particular energy of a room where people had been working intensively for several days and were starting to show it around the edges. Sterling Kessler was there, and he looked at Callum when he came in with an expression that was completely neutral in the way that takes effort. Arden was there too, in a chair off to the side of the main table, a coffee cup in both hands that she clearly wasn't drinking from so much as holding. There were 2 people from Ortega's task force, not Ortega herself, but her partner and another detective Callum hadn't met. And there were 3 people from what Callum read as an outside consulting firm, youngish, with laptops, and the slightly dazed quality of people who'd been pulled into a situation faster than they'd been fully briefed. Callum took the open seat he was offered, set his jacket on the back of the chair, and looked at the monitors. The primary display showed a split feed of the mall security footage, the atrium, the food court, the service corridors time-stamped and overlaid with color-coded tracking markers. Someone had done a significant amount of work on this footage already. Sterling began the briefing. The operational picture, as Kessler laid it out over 20 minutes, was this. In the 6 weeks prior to the mall incident, someone had been quietly gathering intelligence on Arden Wycliffe's schedule, her daughter's routine, and the physical layout of locations they frequented. The information had been harvested through a combination of methods, social engineering of staff, access to calendar systems through a compromised vendor account, and at least 1 physical surveillance visit to the Hartwell Mall in the week before the shooting. The internal breach had been traced to a vendor relationship that Wycliffe Technologies had been in the process of terminating for separate reasons. The vendor's access, it turned out, had not been fully revoked when it should have been a procedural failure on the security team's end that Kessler described in the careful language of someone explaining the mistake of a department he ran. The vendor's access was used to pull scheduling data, Kessler said. That data was then passed, we believe through 2 intermediaries, to the person or persons who hired Foss. Who's the vendor? Callum asked. Kessler looked at him. A technology services company called Meridian Group. They provided cloud storage solutions to Wycliffe Tech for approximately 18 months. The relationship was terminated 6 weeks ago following a contract dispute. They knew their access wasn't revoked. In retrospect, yes. They appeared to have realized the window remained open and used it. Callum looked at the monitors. Is the access fully closed now? Yes, within 24 hours of identifying the breach. So Meridian is the origin point. Who do they connect to? Who's at the end of this? Kessler glanced at Arden before answering, which Callum noted. We have a name, Kessler said. A man named Harris Talbot. He's a former business associate of Ms. Wycliffe's, with an unresolved grievance regarding a failed joint venture from 3 years ago. Unresolved enough to hire someone to grab her daughter. Apparently, the room was quiet for a moment. Callum thought about the particular darkness of a man who would route his grievances through an 8-year-old girl. Where's Talbot now? He asked. Out of the country, Kessler said. We've turned over everything we have to Detective Chen and his team. He nodded toward Ortega's partner. Interpol coordination is in process. Callum looked at Arden. She was watching him in the way she'd been watching him, since he arrived steady, focused, not performing calm, but actually trying to hold it. There was more under the surface than she was showing. He could see the shape of it, but she had good control, and she wasn't letting it run. Is Tessa safe? Callum asked her directly. She's at my sister's. Out of state. A pause. She doesn't know why. That's the right call. I know, Arden said quietly. Then, I was advised by Sterling to send her 3 days ago, and I stalled for 2 of them because I kept thinking it was probably nothing. And she'd just had those bad nights, and I didn't want to uproot her. A beat. I should have moved faster. Callum held her gaze. You moved her. That's what matters. She looked down at her coffee cup. Sterling cleared his throat and redirected the briefing toward the timeline reconstruction. And Callum spent the next hour going through his observations from the food court in the kind of systematic detail that had the consulting team typing steadily, and the two detectives asking questions that were good questions. He walked them through the geometry of it, where he'd been, where Foss had been, the angle and pace, and the specific behavioral signals that had separated Foss from every other person moving through that crowd. At one point, Kessler said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has decided to address something directly rather than circle it, your ability to identify threat behavior in a crowd situation, that's a specialized skill set, Mr. Stroud. One that doesn't typically come from warehouse logistics. No, Callum agreed. Would you like to speak to that? Not particularly. Kessler held his gaze. It would help us assess the value of your observations. My observations are what they are, regardless of where they came from. Callum kept his voice even. If they're useful, use them. If you need a credential attached to them to accept them, that's a different problem. The silence that followed was the kind that has multiple people deciding simultaneously not to speak. Arden did not look up from her coffee cup, but Callum saw the slight shift in her posture that might have been the body's version of agreement. The briefing ended around noon. People began gathering laptops and jackets and organizing next steps. Kessler's team had a list of actions running. The detectives had calls to make. The consulting firm had analysis to finish. Callum put his jacket on and was about to leave when one of the junior analysts, a young woman named Petra, who'd been quiet through most of the session but had clearly been paying attention, called up something on the main monitor display. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "I want to flag this." She pulled up a still image from the building's security feed. The timestamp was from 2 days ago, mid-morning. The image showed a section of hallway on one of the lower floors near the service entrance. A man in maintenance coveralls carrying a tool bag. The image was clear enough to show his face, though Callum didn't recognize him. He badged in with credentials issued to an HVAC contractor that performed work here 4 months ago, Petra said. Those credentials should have been expired. They weren't. Another revoked access that hadn't actually been revoked. Callum looked at the image. He looked at it the way he looked at things when his attention caught on something specific, and he wasn't yet sure why. The man's face was unremarkable. The coveralls looked right. The tool bag was correctly proportioned. "What time was this?" he asked. Petra checked. 9:42 m 2 days ago. "Pull the next 10 minutes of corridor footage," Callum said. Kessler frowned. "We're already running an analysis." "Pull the next 10 minutes," Callum said again, without looking away from the screen. Petra looked at Kessler. Kessler gave a small nod. The footage ran. The maintenance worker moved through the corridor with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged there. He stopped at a utility panel, opened it, appeared to examine something inside. Closed it again. Continued down the hallway. "Stop it there," Callum said. Petra paused the feed. Callum stood up and walked to the monitor. He looked at the frozen image for a moment. He opened the panel and looked at it, Callum said. He didn't do anything to it. He looked at it and closed it again. Maybe he was checking something, Kessler said, with his dominant hand in his tool bag the entire time. The room was quiet. "Where does that corridor lead?" Callum asked. Kessler crossed to the monitor. He studied it. His jaw tightened slightly. "Service elevator, which connects to the executive floors." "What executive floors?" "A beat. 31 and 32. Callum looked at him. "Where's Arden's office?" 32, Arden said from behind them. Callum turned. She was already standing, coffee cup set down, looking at the frozen image on the monitor with an expression that had gone very still. "Is he still in the building?" Callum asked Petra. Petra's fingers were already moving across her keyboard. "His badge shows an exit at 11:07 the same morning. 2 days ago." 2 days ago, Callum said, and nobody flagged the credential issue until today. Kessler said something that Callum didn't fully hear, because he was already thinking past it. Running the geometry again, not a food court this time, but a building. 32 floors, service corridors, elevator access, the gap between a scheduled threat and an unscheduled one. Talbot was out of the country, but that didn't mean his operation had paused. It might have accelerated, with Foss burned and the timeline compressed. His phone buzzed. He checked it. A text from Detective Ortega, which was unusual for Ortega, who preferred calls. "Heads up, Foss has been spotted. Ridgeway area. Active surveillance. Maybe moving toward Financial District. Alerting your contact at WT." Callum read it twice. The financial district was where they were standing. He looked up. "We need to move her," he said. Kessler, who had apparently just received his own alert, was already on his radio. "All teams, this is Kessler. I need positions on executive floor access points immediately." "That's not going to be fast enough," Callum said. "Mr. Stroud, he's already been in the building. He knows the floor layout. He knows the camera positions." Callum was looking at the monitor, at the footage of the man in the coveralls, and he was rerunning the detail that had nagged at him since Petra pulled it up. The dominant hand stayed in the bag. The panel opened and closed without touching anything inside. A man who had not been there to fix anything. He was marking positions. He was in here 2 days ago, and he wasn't fixing anything. He was marking camera positions and access routes. The room had gone very quiet. Arden was watching him. "Where do you want me?" Callum said to her. Kessler cut in. "Mr. Stroud."
You are not security personnel?
Sterling. Arden's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with the precision of something she'd used to cut through rooms for a long time. Let him work. Kessler's jaw worked. He made a decision and stepped back. Callum looked at the monitor layout, 9 camera feeds, covering various sections of the building. He moved from screen to screen with the quick, methodical focus of someone running a specific checklist that existed only in his head. Building entrance, check. Lobby, check. Service entrance, check. Parking structure, check. He stopped at the feed covering the service corridor on the 23rd floor. There was a maintenance worker. Different man than in the 2-day-old footage. But the coveralls were the same contractor's uniform. And the hand was in the bag. And the pace was the practiced, unhurried pace of someone who had rehearsed looking like they belonged. "There," Callum said. Petra pulled it full screen. Kessler got on his radio immediately. "All units, service corridor 23. We have a possible unauthorized." But the man on the screen had already looked up. Not at a camera directly. At a reflective surface near a junction in the corridor, a sheet metal panel that caught the angle of the camera housing. He'd seen the camera. Or he'd seen the camera shift, because someone in the security operations center had just cued it to full screen, which meant the motorized housing had moved. He moved fast. Not running, not yet, but fast, the bag coming off his shoulder, and he went for the service stairwell door and was through it in under 4 seconds. "Stairwell," Callum said. "He's going up, not down. He's not running to exit. He's going for his target. He's ahead of schedule because something spooked him and he's compressing." He looked at Kessler. "How many people do you have between that stairwell and the 32nd floor?" Kessler was talking into his radio, and Callum could tell from the responses coming back that the answer was not enough, because the team had been repositioning toward the main building entrances based on the alert about Foss being spotted near the building's perimeter, and the interior coverage had thinned. "I'm going," Callum said. "You're not armed. Neither is he, or he'd have already used it." He was moving toward the door. His play is access, not force. He needs to get somewhere, not shoot anyone. He stopped, looked at Arden. "Stay here. Don't move for the exits unless Sterling personally moves you." "Understood?" She met his eyes. Something moved across her face, not quite fear, not quite the thing past fear. "Understood," she said. He went. The service stairwell was 3 corridors and a keycard access point away from the security center. Callum moved fast, not sprinting, but covering ground with the efficiency of someone who isn't wasting any movement. His arm protested on the first door. He hit the push bar with his right forearm by instinct and felt the stitches pull and registered the pain and kept moving. The service stairwell was concrete and fluorescent lighting and the particular echo of an enclosed vertical space. He came through the door on the 23rd floor landing and listened. Footsteps above. Measured but quick. Already past the 24th floor, landing by the sound of it. Callum went up. He was in better shape than the desk and conference room version of Sterling Kessler's security team, but he was not in the shape he'd been in 12 years ago, and his arm was making its opinion very clear by the time he passed the 26th floor. He took the stairs 2 at a time, using the railing on his left side, and focused on the footsteps above and the math of the distance. The man was moving toward 32. He had a head start and he knew the route. Callum had neither of those advantages. What he had was the ability to think 2 moves ahead of someone who thought he was only being followed, not cut off. He stopped at 28, came through the stairwell door into the 28th floor corridor, moved to the building's central elevator bank at a run, pressed the button, and waited the 4 seconds it took for the car to arrive, which felt like considerably longer than 4 seconds, and stepped in and pressed 32. The elevator was faster than the stairs. He came out on 32 with the doors opening on a corridor that was at this specific moment empty in the particular way that means something has recently moved through it. He stepped out and looked left and right. To his right, a door to an office suite was swinging closed. Still moving. Callum went right. He came through the door into reception area, empty desk, 2 chairs, a wall of frosted glass panels. The door at the far end of the reception area was a heavier internal door, closed. He crossed the reception area and came through it into a wider corridor that ran the length of the executive floor. At the far end of the corridor, a man in maintenance coveralls stood in front of a closed office door, working at the lock with something from his bag. Not Foss. Different man. Callum could see the profile clearly from the corridor's length. He was focused on the lock, moving with the urgent efficiency of someone who needed to be through that door in the next 30 seconds. He hadn't heard Callum. Callum moved down the corridor quietly, covering the distance, getting within 20 feet before the man's peripheral awareness finally registered something and he turned. What happened next was brief and unpleasant and did not go the way the man in the coveralls had expected. He went for the bag, and Callum was already inside the reach of it, his left arm controlling the man's right, his shoulder dropping to take the bag's momentum and redirect it. The bag hit the wall. The man went for Callum's injured arm, with his free hand not randomly. He'd seen the bandaging and went for it deliberately, which told Callum something about the man's training and connected, and the pain that went through Callum's right arm was immediate and significant, and he filed it and kept working. He had the man on the floor in approximately 8 seconds. Not clean. The man was trained and he fought, and Callum took a knee to the ribs and an elbow that caught the side of his jaw, and by the time he had the man's wrists secured with a zip tie from the tool bag, the irony of which was not lost on him. He was breathing hard, and his arm was pulsing with a heat that suggested at least one of the stitches had given way. He was sitting on the floor of the 32nd floor corridor with his back against the wall, and the secured man face down in front of him when Sterling Kessler's security team came through the stairwell door with their hands on sidearms. They stopped. Callum looked up at them. "He's secure," Callum said. "Check the bag. Carefully." He paused to breathe, and someone should probably tell Detective Ortega that the Foss sighting near the perimeter was a diversion. Her team's been looking at the wrong man. Call her directly, not through the task force dispatch, or it'll take 20 minutes to sort out. The security personnel looked at each other. The one nearest Callum, a woman in her 30s, who carried herself like she'd been in the military. More recently, then Callum had crouched down and checked the man on the floor. "He's secure," she confirmed to her team. Then to Callum, "Are you injured?" "Arm. It's not critical." He looked down at his sleeve. Dark again. "Same arm. This is becoming a habit." She almost smiled. Didn't quite get there. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos. Kessler's full team on the 32nd floor. Detective Ortega's people arriving within 15 minutes of a call from Callum's direct line, the man from the corridor being processed with the tool bag, which turned out to contain nothing. Callum hadn't expected, and several things that confirmed the operation had been several steps more sophisticated than a single opportunistic contractor. Arden arrived on 32 with 2 of Kessler's people flanking her. She came through the door and stopped when she saw Callum still sitting against the wall, while a paramedic from the building's emergency response team rewrapped his arm with the resigned professionalism of someone who had recently done this same job. She looked at the floor, at the man being processed by Ortega's people, at the tool bag laid open on the carpet, at Callum. She crossed the corridor and crouched down to his level, which was not something he'd expected a person in her position to do. "You went after him alone," she said. "Your team was covering the perimeter. You should have waited." "He was 30 seconds from wherever he was going," Callum said. Waiting wasn't an option. She looked at his arm, at the fresh dark spread on the bandaging. "How bad?" "Not bad. Pulled some stitches." He paused. "I'll need to go back to urgent care." "You'll go to an actual hospital," Arden said, "with a doctor who has adequate information about your medical history and proper equipment." She said it in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than issuing an instruction, but the underlying steel was clear enough. "Okay," Callum said, "because that fight wasn't worth having right now, and I'm going with you." He looked at her. She looked back at him without flinching. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. There was something different in her face now from the Hartwell Mall, from the conference room, from the security briefing. Not softer, exactly. More honest. as if the event of the last 20 minutes had knocked away something that had been sitting between them. "All right," he said. Sterling Kessler appeared at Arden's shoulder. He looked at Callum with an expression that Callum couldn't entirely read, something with more complexity to it than hostility or gratitude, more like a man recalibrating against a framework that had just been significantly adjusted. "We have a lot to discuss," Kessler said to Callum, not unfriendly. "Tomorrow," Arden said without looking up. "Arden, Sterling, tomorrow." She stood, extended a hand to Callum, not as a gesture, as actual assistance, matter of fact, offered because he was on the floor with a rewrapped arm, and getting up was going to be slightly graceless. He took it and stood, and let her take more of his weight than he strictly needed to, because his ribs hurt where the knee had connected, and some things weren't worth performing through. Detective Ortega arrived at that point, came through the corridor with her jacket on, and her expression already working through the operational sequence of what had happened. She took in the scene, took in Callum, took in Arden. The Foss sighting was a diversion, Ortega said to Callum. "I know. How did you—" "Too convenient," he said. "Foss burned as an asset after the mall. Using him as a visible distraction is a way to pull coverage toward the perimeter while the actual operation goes internal." He paused. "Someone in Talbot's network knows how corporate security teams respond to a known threat. They're adapting." Ortega looked at him steadily. "Mr. Stroud, do you want to tell me now, or do you want to keep doing this?" "Doing what?" "Doing this," she said, with a gesture that encompassed the corridor, the secured man, the tool bag, all of it, with a warehouse ID badge. Callum looked at her, looked at Arden, looked at Kessler, who had the expression of a man who had been thinking the same thing as Ortega for considerably longer. He thought about the wooden box in the back of his closet, the 6 years of sealed records, the photograph of 6 men in gear he'd looked at and put back without quite being able to explain why he'd needed to look at it at all. He thought about Emmett, who was at school right now, probably arguing about something with someone, perfectly safe and entirely unaware that his father was sitting on the executive floor of a glass tower with a rewrapped arm and a decision he'd been circling for 10 days. "Not in a hospital hallway," Callum said to Ortega. "But yes, soon." Ortega nodded, satisfied with that for now. Arden's car was a black SUV with a driver who held the door and didn't speak. Callum got in because walking to the parking garage with his arm in its current state was more defiant than practical, and Arden got in from the other side, and they rode toward the hospital in a silence that was more comfortable than it had any right to be. Outside, the city went past the tinted windows in the particular way cities go past when you're inside a car that moves differently than the traffic around it. The financial district thinning to mid-rise neighborhoods, then broader streets, then the hospital complex with its parking structure and its signage and its everything that would eventually cost more than Callum had immediately available. He stared out the window and thought about that, and Arden, apparently following the direction of something in his posture, said, "The bills are covered. Please don't argue with me about it." "I wasn't going to," he said. She looked at him. He looked out the window. "That's a change," she said. "I pulled stitches stopping someone from getting to your floor," he said. "At some point the math changes." A beat of silence. Then, "Thank you," Arden said. She said it simply, without the corporate scaffolding she'd put around everything in the conference room. Just 2 words with the full weight of what she actually meant behind them. Callum nodded. The car continued toward the hospital through the afternoon city, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. The hospital put 11 new stitches in, alongside the 8 original ones, which the attending physician described as a creative approach to wound management in the tone of a man who had decided humor was more productive than judgment. Callum's ribs were bruised but not cracked, which he'd already suspected from the quality of the pain. His jaw had swollen on the left side where the elbow had connected, and the doctor told him to ice it and avoid chewing anything substantial for a few days, which struck Callum as optimistic given the practical requirements of being alive. Arden stayed. Not in the examination room, she gave him that much, but in the waiting area outside, and when Callum came out with his arm freshly wrapped and a prescription for antibiotics he was going to have to figure out how to fill before tomorrow morning, she was sitting in a chair with her phone face down in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance. She looked up when she heard him. 11, he said, meaning stitches. I heard. The nurse came out. She stood, picked up her jacket. Ready? You didn't have to wait. I know. She said it the same way she'd said it in the car, patient and slightly final, as if this particular category of argument was one she'd already decided she wasn't going to keep having with him. They didn't go back to the tower. The driver took Callum to his apartment building, and Arden walked him to the entrance, which he didn't ask for and didn't argue about. And when he turned on the sidewalk to tell her she should go, she was looking at the building's facade with an expression he couldn't read. It was a decent building. Nothing wrong with it. But it was the kind of decent that communicated a specific set of facts about the person living there, the economy of it, the managed distance from anything more comfortable. He watched her take it in and felt the familiar friction of having someone see where he actually lived rather than where they'd imagined him living. Emmett's been here his whole life, Callum said. Not defensively, just to fill the space. It looks like a good building, Arden said. He almost laughed. It was such a careful thing to say. It is, he said. Good neighbors. Safe Street, works fine. She looked at him then, directly, and what was in her face was something he hadn't entirely seen there before, not pity, which he would have rejected immediately, but a kind of recognition. Like she was seeing the whole thing clearly for the first time, and understanding something she should have understood weeks ago. I owe you an apology, she said. You already apologized. I apologized in the conference room with Sterling 20 feet away and a legal team on standby, she said. That wasn't an apology. That was a managed conversation. She paused. A cab went by in the street behind her, close enough that she shifted slightly on the sidewalk. I treated you like a variable I needed to control. From the moment I looked up and saw you bleeding on the food court floor, my first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was risk assessment. Callum didn't say anything. That's who I am, apparently, she said. Or who I became. I'm not entirely sure when it happened. She looked down at the sidewalk for a moment. Tessa talked about you every day for a week after the mall. Do you know what she said? She said you talked to her like she was a person. While you were bleeding. She said you asked her name. She was scared, Callum said. Asking her name gave her something to do with her brain besides panic. I know that's why you did it, Arden said. She didn't know that. She thought you just wanted to know her name. They stood there for a moment, in the early evening light, the sidewalk solid under their feet, and the city going about its business around them. I shouldn't have let Sterling contact your employer, she said. That was wrong. Regardless of protocol. You didn't authorize it. I employed the man who did it. In my name, with resources I pay for, she met his eyes. Same thing. Callum thought about the 2 days of pulled shifts, about Gary's uncomfortable phone call, about the math of that week's bills and the decision he'd made about which one to move. It cost me, he said, not to punish her with it. Just because she'd been honest and the honest answer was yes, it had. I know, she said. I'm sorry. She said it plainly without scaffolding or qualifications. I'm genuinely sorry, Callum. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He stood with that for a second. Okay, he said. She nodded. Seemed to consider something. Then, Sterling's been removed from his position. That caught him off guard. When? This afternoon while you were being stitched up. I made the call from the waiting room. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she probably made most operational decisions clearly, without apparent second-guessing, in the full understanding that it was hers to make. The credential management failures alone would have been enough. What happened in the building today was a direct consequence of gaps his team should have closed weeks ago. And the way he handled you from the conference room to this morning that told me things about his judgment I can't walk back. He wasn't wrong to be suspicious of me, Callum said. He was wrong in how he acted on it. She paused. There's a difference between doing your job and using your position to make someone's life difficult because they don't fit your idea of who belongs in a room. Callum looked at her. That's a specific thing to say. I've had a lot of time to think in the past few weeks, she said. And I've been thinking about the fact that you were in my building today on my request, helping my security team do a job they were failing, with a wound in your arm from protecting my daughter. And Sterling stood in that corridor and told you that you weren't security personnel. She held his gaze. I was in the room. I should have said something sooner than I did. You said it. Late you said it, Callum said, again, because that was the part that mattered. She let out a slow breath. Then she did something he didn't expect. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out a small card and held it out to him. Not a business card. A handwritten card, the kind that came with flowers or gifts. He took it. The handwriting was a child's, large and careful, slightly uneven. The letters of someone who'd learned them recently enough to still be concentrating. Dear Callum, thank you for getting me down. My ice cream was ruined, but that's okay. Emmett was nice. From Tessa, he read it twice. She wrote it herself, Arden said. I only helped her spell your name. He folded the card carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Tell her she's welcome, he said. His voice came out slightly different than he'd intended. You could tell her yourself, Arden said. She's coming back from my sister's Friday. She's been asking if she can meet Emmett properly, without the chaos. Callum thought about that. I'll ask him, he said. He'll say yes. He's been asking about her too, but he doesn't know he's asking, he just keeps mentioning the ice cream. Arden laughed. It surprised both of them. He thought the sudden, genuine quality of it, unguarded, the real version of a sound she probably kept on a tighter leash than that in most situations. That's very Tessa, she said. She told me the same thing, that she felt bad the ice cream was wasted. They'll get along fine, Callum said. I think so too, Arden said. The driver was still at the curb. The evening was cooling around them, the light going amber. Callum was aware of his arm and his ribs, and the fact that Emmett would be home in an hour and would need dinner and would have questions that Callum was going to have to answer carefully. I want to offer you something, Arden said, and I want to be clear that I'm not offering it because I feel guilty, or because I'm trying to manage you, or because I think you need rescuing. She looked at him steadily. I'm offering it because I watched you operate today, and at the mall, and in that briefing room, and you are the most capable person I have seen function under pressure in a long time. And I have met a lot of people who are supposed to be good at that. Callum waited. I need a director of corporate security, she said. Not a replacement Sterling Kessler. Something different, a complete restructuring of how we think about threat assessment and close protection for the company and for my family. The credential failures, the response gaps, the inability to identify what you identified in 40 seconds on a monitor, all of that tells me the entire framework needs to be rebuilt. She paused. I want you to rebuild it. The streetlight above them flickered once and held. I'm a warehouse worker, Callum said. You were a Navy SEAL, she said. For 6 years in a unit that doesn't put its operations in the public record. You identified a trained contractor in a panicking crowd in under 10 seconds. You flagged a surveillance visit from 2 days of archived footage that my entire security team had reviewed and missed. You stopped an active incursion on the executive floor of my building with a bruised rib and a freshly stitched arm and no weapon. She paused. You want to keep moving boxes. That's your choice, and I'll respect it. But don't tell me you're a warehouse worker like that's the full sentence. Callum was quiet for a moment. The pay, he said, because that was the practical place to start. She told him. He kept his face neutral, which required some effort, because the number she said was more than 3 times what he made at the warehouse and included benefits that would have solved several of the calculations he ran in his head on the first of every month. Health coverage, he said. Full family coverage from day one. He thought about Emmett's school, about the rear tires on the car, about the urgent care clinic on Dalton Street, and the specific expression on the doctor's face when he'd handed over his insurance card. I'm not qualified on paper, he said. No corporate security credentials. No industry certifications. You can get them, she said. I'm not hiring a resume. I'm hiring the man who figured out what my entire security apparatus missed. She paused. And if it helps, I've already spoken to 2 people from your former unit. I won't tell you who, because they insisted. But they both said the same thing. What did they say? That if Callum Stroud is willing to work for you, you are the luckiest employer in the building. He stared at her. I made some calls after the conference room, she said, without apology. After I realized I'd badly misjudged who I was dealing with. I needed to understand. You dug into my sealed record. I made calls to people who knew you. I didn't read anything classified. She held his gaze. I was trying to understand who you actually were. I'm not sorry I did it, but I understand if that bothers you. It did bother him, slightly. He held that, examined it, and was honest enough with himself to recognize that her reasoning was not entirely unlike his own when something didn't add up. You found a way to understand it better. He'd been doing the same with Talbot's operation for 2 weeks. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. And I need to talk to Emmett. Something moved in her face at that. You'd talk to your son before making a decision like this? He's 8, Callum said. He's not voting. But he's the reason the decision matters. So yeah, I tell him about things that are going to change his life. She was quiet for a moment. Then Tessa asked me about every major decision I make. She's been doing it since she was 6. I thought it was just something she did. She paused. Now I'm wondering if I taught her that. Probably, Callum said. Kids learn from what you actually do, not what you tell them. She nodded slowly. She was thinking about something, and he didn't interrupt it. Think about it, she said finally. Take the time you need. The offer isn't going anywhere. She walked back to the car. The driver opened the door. She got in without looking back, and the SUV pulled away from the curb and into traffic and was gone. Callum stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He went upstairs, fed himself something from the refrigerator that barely qualified as dinner, and was still sitting at the kitchen table when Emmett came home from the neighbors, where he'd been since school. Dropped his backpack by the door with a crash that suggested it weighed as much as he did, and then stopped when he saw his father's arm. Again, Emmett said, 11 this time. Dad, I know Emmett. His son came and sat across from him at the kitchen table, the way he sometimes did when he'd decided something was serious enough to require the table. He put both arms on the surface and looked at Callum with the particular gravity he got sometimes, the gravity that made him look about 35. What happened? Emmett said. Callum told him the relevant parts. Not all of it, not the geometry of the corridor or the specifics of the threat, because Emmett was 8 but the shape of it, that he'd helped stop someone from getting to a place they shouldn't have been, that it had gotten physical, that he was fine. Emmett listened without interrupting, which was not his natural state, which meant he was taking it seriously. Is the girl okay? Emmett said. Tessa, she's fine. She wasn't there today. She's coming back Friday. She wrote me a note too, Emmett said. Callum blinked. What? She wrote me a note. Ms. Wycliffe had someone drop it off at school. The office called me out of class. He said it with the careful casualness of someone working hard not to seem as affected as they were. It said, sorry I got your dad's shirt bloody, and I hope you weren't too scared. Callum looked at his son. She spelled you wrong, Emmett added. She put your. She's 8, Callum said. I know. I didn't say it was bad. Emmett picked at a scratch on the table's surface. I wrote back. You wrote back. I gave it to the office lady to return. I said she didn't need to apologize, and also that I wasn't that scared. He paused. I was a little scared. I know, Callum said. You were too, right? Emmett looked up. At least a little. At least a little, Callum said. Emmett nodded, accepting this as the honest answer it was. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen for a moment, the refrigerator cycling on in the background, the street sounds coming through the window. I was offered a job today, Callum said. Emmett went still. What kind of job? Security. For the company Tessa's mom runs. They need someone to oversee how the building and the family are protected. He paused. It pays a lot more than the warehouse. Good health insurance. Real benefits. Emmett stared at him. That's better. It's a lot of responsibility. You can do responsibility. There might be situations like today sometimes, where things get complicated. Emmett was quiet. He wasn't performing consideration, he was actually thinking, working through it in the way he worked through things that mattered to him, which was visibly and without hurry. Would we still live here? Emmett asked. For now. Maybe somewhere else eventually. That's a ways off. Would I still go to my school? Yes. Would you be home more or less? Callum thought about that carefully. Different schedule. Probably more predictable hours than the warehouse, but some days would be long. Is it what you want? Emmett asked. Callum looked at him. 8 years old, sitting across the kitchen table, asking a question that most adults took years to think to ask. I don't know yet, Callum said honestly. It's closer to what I know how to do than moving boxes is. You knew how to do what you did today, Emmett said. At the mall too. I could tell. He paused. It's okay if you're good at something, Dad. You don't have to hide it from me. Callum held very still. I'm not hiding anything from you, he said. I know you were in the military, Emmett said. More than you say. I'm not dumb. I know you're not dumb. Then you know I know. Emmett shrugged, with the particular shrug of someone who has decided not to make a bigger deal of something than it needs to be. It's fine. You did it before I was old enough to understand it. Now I'm old enough. He looked at Callum directly. And I think you should take the job. The kitchen was quiet. You do, Callum said. You're good at it. They need someone who's good at it. And the health insurance thing is actually important. Because when you got hurt at the mall, it cost money that we didn't have. And you thought I didn't notice, but I noticed. Callum let out a slow breath. You noticed, he said. I notice most things, Emmett said, without particular drama. I just don't always say them. Callum stood up and went around the table and put a hand on the back of his son's head, briefly, the way he'd done since Emmett was small enough that his hand covered most of it. Emmett let him, which at 8 he sometimes did, and sometimes didn't depending on factors Callum had never fully decoded. Tessa wants to meet you properly, Callum said. Friday, maybe. If you're up for it. I'm up for it, Emmett said immediately, and with zero apparent uncertainty, and then went to get himself a glass of water. The conversation settled in his mind and therefore finished. The following morning, Callum called Arden. She picked up on the second ring. I'll take it, he said. But I have conditions. A brief pause. All right, she said. I restructure from the ground up. That means I choose the team, I set the protocols, and I have final say on any decision in my department. No parallel reporting lines to people I don't know about. Agreed. I need 6 weeks before I start to get the relevant certifications current and review your existing systems fully before I make any changes. I'm not walking in and making calls without understanding the whole picture. That's reasonable. And the veteran employment thing. She paused. What veteran employment thing? I want to build the team from former service members where possible. People with real field experience who can't get a civilian foothold because their records are sealed or their skills don't translate on paper. He paused. Give me latitude on hiring criteria, and I'll staff a security department that'll make what you've had look like a rough draft. Silence on the other end. Not hesitation, he was learning to distinguish those two things in her. This was thinking, the kind she did fast. Yes, she said. You didn't negotiate any of that, he said. Should I have? Most people would. Most people hadn't just watched you stop an armed incursion on their building before lunch. A pause. When can you come in and start the preliminary review? Next week. I need to give Gary notice, Gary, she repeated. My supervisor at the warehouse. He's not a bad person. He deserves 2 weeks' notice, not a phone call. A beat of silence. Okay, she said. He could hear something in her voice, something small and warm that she wasn't naming. 2 weeks. He called Gary from the parking lot of the urgent care clinic where he'd gone to have the 11 stitches checked, and the conversation was brief and slightly uncomfortable in the way. Conversations are when you're leaving a job that was never the right fit, but became familiar enough that leaving it has its own weight. Gary said he wasn't surprised. He said he'd seen the thing on the news. He said Callum had always seemed like someone waiting to be somewhere else. Then he said, "Good luck," in the voice of a man who genuinely meant it, and Callum appreciated that more than he said. He spent the 2 weeks doing several things simultaneously, which was a mode of operation he hadn't been in for a long time, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he hadn't entirely forgotten. He completed 2 online certification modules in corporate security management that he'd been told would be required for the role. He did a full review of Wycliffe Technologies' publicly available security documentation, which was enough to tell him the gaps ran deeper than what he'd seen in the operations center. He spoke twice more with Detective Ortega, who was building the case against Harris Talbot with the methodical determination of someone who had decided it was personal. She wasn't wrong about it being personal, Callum thought. It was personal when the target was a child. On Friday of the first week, Emmett met Tessa. It happened at Arden's house, a house in a neighborhood that Callum navigated to without incident and chose not to have feelings about, architecturally, because that way lay nothing useful. It was large and well-maintained and spoke the same language as the silk blouse and the 32nd floor. And Callum drove his car into the driveway and got out and rang the bell, and that was that. Tessa answered the door before Arden could. She was in jeans and a green sweatshirt, no yellow dress. Her hair was in 2 uneven braids that suggested she'd done them herself without consulting a mirror. She looked at Callum, then at Emmett, and then at the space where Emmett was standing, with the particular focus of a child who has decided something is important. "You're real," she said to Emmett. "Yeah," Emmett said. "You're taller than I thought." "You're shorter," Emmett said. Tessa considered this. "That's fair," she said, and stepped aside to let them in. They ate lunch in the kitchen. Arden made sandwiches, which told Callum something about her that the glass tower and the SUV hadn't. Namely, that she could make sandwiches, and did when the occasion called for it, without apparent discomfort. The children sat across from each other and conducted a conversation at a volume and speed that required both adults to periodically raise their own voices to be heard, and which covered topics including the relative merits of various game platforms, a disagreement about whether dogs or cats were more practical, and a detailed account from Tessa of exactly how the ice cream had melted and why it was the temperature's fault. Emmett listened to the ice cream story with the solemnity it apparently deserved, and agreed that the temperature was primarily responsible. Arden and Callum sat at the same table and had their own conversation, lower and slower, about the preliminary restructuring plan, about timelines, about the question of whether the Talbot case would close fast enough to allow a full security review before Callum officially started. But they also talked about other things, about Emmett's school and Tessa's school, and the logistical absurdity of managing a child's schedule when your own schedule was unpredictable. About what it costs to raise a kid alone, not financially, but in the specific everyday weight of being the only person in the household who could make the decisions. Do you have people? Arden asked. Family, close friends. Someone who takes Emmett when you need them to? A neighbor, Callum said. Mrs. Fenwick. She's 70, and she used to run a daycare, and she treats Emmett like he personally improved her retirement. That sounds like exactly the right person. She is. He paused. You? My sister, Arden said. The one Tessa stayed with. And a friend from college, Dana, who lives 20 minutes away. That's mostly it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. It's a smaller circle than people assume when they look at the everything. People assume money means infrastructure, Callum said. It buys some of it, she said, not the parts that actually matter. He held that in mind as the afternoon moved on, and the kids migrated to the backyard, where there was apparently something involving a ball that Tessa had been setting up since before they arrived. Callum and Arden ended up standing at the kitchen window, watching them negotiate the rules of whatever game this was, which appeared to be in active development as they played it. She's been better since Friday, Arden said. Tessa. The bad nights have mostly stopped. Time, Callum said, and knowing the situation's being handled. And you, Arden said. He looked at her. She knows you stopped it, Arden said. I didn't tell her the details, but she knows you're the reason things are safer now. Kids feel that. She paused. She asked me if you were going to be around more. What did you tell her? I told her yes. She looked at him. I hope that was accurate. It was accurate, Callum said. Outside, Emmett said something that made Tessa laugh so hard. She sat down on the grass entirely, and Callum could hear it even through the glass, the complete, unguarded laughter of a child who has found something genuinely funny and is not holding any of it back. He watched his son stand in someone else's backyard with his hands on his hips, and the satisfied expression of a kid who knows he landed a joke, and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, exactly. More solid than that. I'm going to need an office, he said. Already arranged, Arden said. Of course it is, he said. She almost smiled. Caught it. Let it happen anyway. In the weeks that followed the last one at the warehouse, the orientation at Wycliffe Technologies, the staggering amount of documentation that turned out to be associated with rebuilding a corporate security infrastructure from scratch. Callum's life changed in the specific way that major changes actually happen, which is incrementally and unevenly, and with a significant number of things going wrong in minor ways before they go right. His first hire was a former marine logistics specialist named Claire Addo, who had been working as a parking garage attendant because no corporate security firm would look at her resume twice without a traditional industry background. She was precise, composed, and had a threat assessment instinct that Callum recognized in the first 10 minutes of their conversation as the real thing. She shook his hand when he offered her the position and then looked at the ceiling for a moment and composed herself, and Callum pretended to review something on his desk to give her the privacy of that. His second hire was a former Army intelligence analyst named Reuben Tate, who had a slight limp from an IED and an ability to read surveillance patterns that made the consulting firm's analysis look like rough sketches. His third was a former Coast Guard rescue swimmer, who now handled physical protection protocols with a calmness that the previous team's approach to close protection had never come close to. Sterling Kessler, Callum learned through Ortega, had already quietly found a position at a smaller firm across the state. No public drama. The kind of exit that happens when both parties understand that making noise helps neither of them. Harris Talbot was located in a country that had a cooperation agreement with U.S. federal authorities. The extradition process was slow and procedurally complicated in the way that international legal processes invariably were. But Detective Ortega called Callum every 2 weeks with updates delivered in the tone of someone who had decided this case, was going to close the right way, and was prepared to wait it out. He's not going anywhere, she said on one of these calls. His lawyers are stalling. They'll run out of road eventually. I know, Callum said. You sound tired. New job, he said. A lot of rebuilding. How is it? He thought about it. About Claire Addo composing herself with her eyes on the ceiling. About Reuben Tate's quiet precision with the surveillance data. About the meeting he'd had with Arden that morning, which had run long because they kept getting off the security agenda and onto other things, and neither of them had done very much to get back on track. Good, he said. It's good. He meant it. Harris Talbot's extradition was finalized on a Tuesday in early March, 14 months after a man in a dark hoodie had moved through a panicking crowd toward a little girl in a yellow dress. Detective Ortega called Callum at 7:40 in the morning, while he was making Emmett's lunch and simultaneously reviewing a security protocol update on his laptop, which was more or less what his mornings looked like now, multiple things running at once, managed but never quite orderly, because that was the honest reality of a life with actual content in it. He landed at Dulles at 6:15, Ortega said. Federal custody. Arraignment is scheduled for Thursday. Callum put down the sandwich he was making. It held together. Every piece of it, she said. The Meridian Group cooperation was what sealed it. 3 of their people took plea agreements in exchange for testimony on the full chain from Talbot's instruction to the vendor access to the hiring of Foss to the contractor. You stopped on 32. A pause. Foss himself was picked up in Tampa 6 weeks ago. He's already pled. He'll testify against Talbot in exchange for a reduced sentence. So it's done, Callum said. The criminal part of it, yes. Ortega had the measured satisfaction in her voice of someone who had spent 14 months on a thing and could finally let it be finished. Talbot's attorneys will drag the trial out as long as they can. But the outcome is about as certain as these things get. He's not walking away from this. Callum stood in his kitchen for a moment after the call ended, the half-made sandwich on the counter in front of him. Outside the window, the March morning was pale gray, the kind of light that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. Emmett appeared in the kitchen doorway in his school clothes, his hair doing what it always did in the morning, which was make a case for its own independence. Who was that? Emmett asked. Detective Ortega, the man who caused the trouble. He's in custody. It's over. Emmett absorbed this. He came and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his father with the particular directness he deployed when something mattered to him. Like, actually over, he said. Actually over, Callum said. Emmett was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. And then, is there peanut butter in that sandwich, or just the other stuff? Both, Callum said. Good, Emmett said again and went to get his backpack. Callum finished the sandwich, wrapped it, and thought about what Ortega had said. Every piece of it. The Meridian people cooperating, Foss taking a deal, the chain of evidence holding from origin to execution. 14 months of investigation pulling itself into a shape that would close in a courtroom, cleanly, with consequences that matched what had been attempted. He thought about Tessa in her yellow dress with the melting ice cream, about Emmett holding her hand, about the particular darkness of a man who could route a business grievance through a child in sleep afterward. He thought about all of it, and then he let it settle, the way you let things settle when they're finished, not forgotten, not entirely resolved in some inner accounting sense, but finished in the practical world, which is the part you can actually affect. He drove Emmett to school, came back, changed into his work clothes, and went to do his job. The Wycliffe Technologies Security Department, 1 year into Callum's tenure, looked almost nothing like what it had been. This was not an exaggeration or a figure of speech. The physical space had been reorganized, the monitoring systems upgraded, the vendor access protocols rebuilt from scratch with Claire Addo's obsessive documentation standards applied to every single credentialing process. Reuben Tate had constructed a threat assessment framework that 3 external auditors had reviewed, and after some initial skepticism about the unconventional structure rated as among the most rigorous they'd encountered in a mid-sized tech company. The team itself was 12 people now. 9 of the 12 were former service members. None of them had traditional corporate security resumes. All of them were, in Callum's assessment, exactly right for the work. This had not happened without friction. The HR department had pushed back twice on Callum's hiring criteria, flagging the lack of conventional industry credentials. Callum had sat in those meetings and explained his reasoning without raising his voice and without backing down, and Arden had let him run those conversations without intervening, which was both the right call and, he understood, a deliberate one. She was watching how he handled institutional resistance the same way she watched everything, with that comprehensive attention she brought to anything she decided mattered. The third time HR raised the issue, Arden was in the room, and she said, with the surgical precision of someone who had waited to speak until the most effective moment, Callum's hiring record is producing our best security outcomes in the company's history. The credential question is closed. And it was. He had learned things about her in a year that the conference room and the corporate context had obscured. He had learned that she worked from 6 in the morning and responded to emails at 11 at night and was aware this was a problem she hadn't solved. He had learned that she was genuinely funny when she wasn't managing a room, with a dry, quick humor that appeared without warning and disappeared just as fast. He had learned that she second-guessed herself more than her public posture suggested that the confidence was real. But the certainty behind it was not always as solid as it looked, and she knew it, and she managed that gap with effort. He had learned that she was harder on herself about Tessa than about anything else. Not in a performed way, not in the way that people perform parental guilt when they think someone is watching. In the real way, the private way, the way that showed up in small moments the evening she'd mentioned offhandedly that she'd missed Tessa's school recital because of a board call, and the flatness in her voice when she said it that had nothing to do with Callum being present, and everything to do with the fact that she minded, genuinely minded, and had no clean way to resolve it. "You can't get that one back," Callum said when she mentioned it. They were in his office, late, going over something that had stopped being the thing they were talking about some time before. "I know," she said, "but she knows you minded." She said she didn't care. Arden looked at her coffee cup. "Which means she cared." "Yes," Callum said, "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. "I missed things with her when she was younger. Board meetings and launches and things that felt urgent at the time and probably were, actually. But," she stopped. "She's 9 now. I'm doing the math on how many recitals there are left before she thinks recitals are embarrassing, and the number is smaller than I'd like." "Then go to the next one," Callum said. She looked at him. "That's the whole advice?" "That's it," he said. "You already know you should have gone. Knowing it harder won't help. Going to the next one will." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face shifted the particular shift he'd learned to recognize as her deciding to accept something instead of continuing to analyze it. "You're very direct," she said. "You pay me to keep things from getting complicated," he said. "Seems like the same skill," she smiled. The real one, the unguarded one. He was familiar with it by now, had cataloged the difference between the ones she deployed professionally and the ones she didn't see coming. And he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that the distinction mattered to him more than it probably should. That was the thing he hadn't been fully prepared for, or hadn't let himself be prepared for the way the year had moved them from the careful, managed distance of an employer-employee dynamic into something that was considerably harder to define and considerably harder to maintain distance from. It hadn't happened in a single moment. It had happened in the accumulation of small ones, late evenings in the office that ran longer than necessary, lunches that had started as operational and stopped being operational, conversations that drifted away from work with a naturalness that neither of them arrested. It had happened in the children, too, which was perhaps the part he hadn't anticipated most clearly. Emmett and Tessa had settled into a friendship that operated on its own terms entirely, with the specific self-sufficiency of children who have found someone whose frequency they're comfortable on. They didn't need to be managed or facilitated. They argued about things with the comfortable directness of siblings, and agreed on others with the loyalty of people who have decided the other person is in their corner. Tessa came to Emmett's baseball games and sat in the bleachers with Arden, and Emmett went to Tessa's school art show in November and spent 20 minutes in genuine conversation with her about a painting of a horse that she'd done in a color she described as almost orange, but not quite. Callum had watched that conversation from across the room and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. He had a name for it now. It was the feeling of a life assembling itself into a shape he hadn't designed, around people he hadn't chosen in any strategic sense, into something that was more complete than the version he'd been running on for the better part of 8 years. He sat with that for several months before he did anything about it. He sat with it because he was cautious by nature and training, and because doing something about it meant acknowledging that what he was doing about it could go wrong in ways that would affect 4 people rather than 2, and that calculus required real thought rather than the version of real thought that is actually just rationalized readiness. He also sat with it because Arden was his employer, and that fact had a weight that didn't disappear because he'd stopped thinking of their relationship as primarily professional. He brought it up with her directly, which was consistent with who he was, and which he expected to be uncomfortable, and it was. They were walking. They'd developed a habit of working meetings on foot around the block when the building felt too contained, which was Arden's idea originally, and which Callum had found, to his mild surprise, actually useful. It was a Tuesday evening in October, the air cool enough to require jackets, the city doing its evening thing around them. "I need to say something," Callum said. "All right," she said, with the care of someone who has noticed a shift in register and is not pretending not to. He started and stopped because he was better at direct action than at direct speech on certain topics, and this was one of those topics. He tried again. "I'm aware of what our working relationship is. I'm aware that it creates a real complication for what I'm about to say. I want to name that before I say it, because it matters, and I don't want to pretend it doesn't. Arden was walking at her usual pace. She didn't alter it. Okay, she said. I think you know what I'm going to say, he said. I think I do, she said. Then you tell me, he said, whether the complication is the kind that ends the conversation before it starts. A full block passed. A group of people coming out of a restaurant, a cab changing lanes, the city's ambient sounds filling the space between them. No, Arden said. It's not. He looked at her. I've been aware of the complication for about 4 months, she said, with the precise tone of a person who has also been doing careful math, and is relieved to be allowed to show it. I wasn't going to say anything, because I wasn't sure if I was seeing what I was seeing, or seeing what I wanted to see. Which is it? He asked. What I was seeing, she said. They walked for another half block. This will be complicated, Callum said. I know, professionally. The optics. I'm aware of the optics, she said with a slight edge. I've been managing optics for a long time. I just want us to be clear-eyed about it. Callum. She stopped walking. He stopped. They were on the sidewalk, with the evening city behind them, in approximately the same configuration they'd stood in outside his apartment building 14 months ago, on a different kind of threshold. I have run a company for 9 years. I have made decisions with larger consequences than this every single quarter. I understand what I'm deciding. A beat, do you? He thought about the wooden box in the closet. About Emmett's voice saying it's okay if you're good at something, Dad. About the photograph of 6 men in gear that he'd looked at and put back, and the slow understanding that the past doesn't have to be a place you're trying to escape from it, can just be a place you came from, with its own weight and its own value, and you don't have to hide it or be defined by it either. Yes, he said. Then we're clear-eyed, she said, and started walking again. It was not a romantic moment. Nothing about it was particularly cinematic, but it was honest, and it was mutual, and it was the beginning of something that had the structure of a real thing rather than the structure of a story, which meant it was sometimes difficult, and sometimes awkward, and sometimes required conversations, that neither of them was entirely comfortable with. Arden told Tessa in her own time, in her own way, which Callum respected and didn't ask about. Tessa apparently responded by asking whether Emmett was going to be around more, and when told yes, said okay and returned to what she'd been doing. Arden relayed this to Callum with the bemused expression of a parent who has spent significant time anticipating a reaction and received something considerably more practical. Callum told Emmett over dinner, plainly, without building up to it overmuch, because Emmett responded better to plain information than to delivery systems. Emmett put his fork down, looked at his plate, looked up. Ms. Wycliffe, he said yes. Tessa's mom, yes. A pause. Does that mean would we all? Not yet, Callum said. Maybe eventually. Slowly. Nobody's going anywhere or changing anything fast. Emmett thought about it. She's nice, he said finally. She came to 3 of my baseball games. I know. She knows about pitching, like actually knows. She told me about my stance, and she was right. He considered. That was kind of annoying, because I didn't want to fix my stance, and then I fixed it, and it was better. That sounds like her, Callum said. Yeah. Emmett picked his fork back up. Okay, he said. Okay. It was as close to a blessing as Callum was going to get from a 9-year-old with opinions about pitching stance, and he accepted it as the genuine thing it was. The Veteran Employment Initiative launched publicly in January of the following year, 15 months, after Callum had first raised it as a condition of his hiring. It was not by that point limited to Wycliffe Technology's security department. Over the course of those 15 months, the program had expanded, first to other departments within the company, then to 3 partner companies in the tech sector that Arden had personally spoken to about the model. A foundation structure had been built to support it, with Claire Addo as its operational director, a promotion she had accepted with characteristic precision, requesting 48 hours to review the full scope of the role before giving an answer. The launch event was held in the company's main conference space, which had been configured for standing attendance and which was full. Callum stood at the back of the room and watched the people who'd come current participants in the program, prospective partners, a handful of journalists, several government representatives who had become interested once the scale became visible. He watched Arden at the front of the room, delivering remarks with the polished confidence she brought to public contexts, and knew from the things she'd said in private the doubts, the second-guessing, the 2 weeks of back and forth about the language in the launch statement that the confidence was real and also earned and also cost something to sustain. Reuben Tate appeared at his elbow. Nice crowd, Reuben said. Good program, Callum said. You built it. We built it. Arden funded it and opened the doors. You run the assessment framework. Claire built the operation structure. He paused. I suggested it. Reuben looked at him with the expression he'd learned, meant Callum was underselling something deliberately, and Reuben had decided not to push it. They'd developed a functional language with each other, over the years shorthand, comfortable silences, the specific communication of people who have spent time under pressure together and understand each other's rhythms. 47 placements so far, Reuben said, across all 3 partner companies. 61, Callum said. 2 more came through this morning. Reuben almost smiled. Callum had learned that almost smiles from Reuben were worth more than full smiles from most people. Arden was wrapping up her remarks. The room was attentive in the way. Rooms get attentive when the person speaking has something real to say and is saying it clearly. She talked about the program. She talked about the gap between service and civilian life, the specific and largely invisible difficulty of translating a decade of genuine capability into a context that requires credentials to believe in it. She talked about what Callum had built in the security department without naming him directly, because he'd asked hers not to, and she'd honored it. And then she said something that he hadn't heard her rehearse, something that didn't have the sound of prepared remarks. I spent a long time running this company on a specifics of assumptions, she said, about what capability looks like, about what background means, about who belongs in which rooms and why. She paused. I was wrong about most of it. Not maliciously wrong. I didn't think I was making those assumptions. I thought I was being rigorous. Being rigorous turned out to be a different thing than I thought it was, and it took someone showing me the gap between what I thought I was seeing and what was actually there to understand it. The room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet when something honest has just been said in public. This program exists because of that gap, she said, and because someone with every reason not to bother decided to build a bridge across it anyway. Callum looked at the floor. Reuben said nothing, which was the right call. After the event, after the handshakes, and the conversations, and the journalist who wanted a quote, and the government representative who wanted a follow-up meeting, Callum ended up in the building's atrium with a coffee he'd gotten from the catering table and a few minutes of quiet while the room behind him slowly emptied. Tessa found him there. She was 10 now. The uneven braids of the backyard afternoon had been replaced by something more intentional, though still slightly asymmetrical in a way that suggested she'd done it mostly herself. She was wearing a blue dress, not yellow-blue, and the expression she'd had since he'd first met her, that specific directness that he suspected she'd inherited from her mother and would deploy with increasing effectiveness as she got older. That was long, she said, meaning the event. It was. Mom talks a lot when it's official stuff. She has a lot to say, Callum said. Tessa considered this. Do you think it'll actually help people, the program? He looked at her. What makes you ask? She shrugged, not dismissively, thoughtfully. At school, we did a thing about programs that were supposed to help people and didn't. Like, they sounded good, but then they didn't actually work. I was wondering if this one actually works. 61 people have jobs they didn't have before, Callum said. That's a concrete number. Whether it scales, whether it changes things at a bigger level that's harder to know yet. She absorbed this. Emmett said you were in the military, and they didn't help you much when you got out. Callum looked at her. Emmett said that? He said you figured it out yourself, and it was hard. She looked up at him with the straightforwardness of a child who doesn't yet understand that certain conversations have boundaries. Was it? He thought about the warehouse, about the urgent care clinic on Dalton Street, about the calculations on the first of every month, about the wooden box in the closet and the 6 years of sealed records and the specific weight of being trained for something that didn't have a civilian translation anyone was willing to accept. Yes, he said. It was hard. Then the program is good, Tessa said, with the simple finality of someone who has resolved the question to her own satisfaction, because it means other people don't have to figure it out by themselves. He looked at the 10-year-old standing beside him in the atrium. Yeah, he said. That's about right. Arden appeared from the direction of the now empty event space, jacket off, the particular look of someone who has just finished a performance and is returning to being a person. She stopped when she saw them Callum with his coffee, Tessa beside him, and something moved across her face that was too quiet and too complete to be called any single thing. Ready? She said. Tessa's been auditing the program, Callum said. Of course she has, Arden said. She looked at her daughter. Verdict? It's good, Tessa said. It's actually useful, not just good sounding. High praise, Arden said. I'm serious, I know you are, Arden said. That's why it's high praise. They left the building together, the three of them, and Emmett was waiting in the car with the driver. He'd come to the event for the first half before announcing that he needed air, and retreating to the car with his book, which was a 9-year-old's prerogative. And when Tessa got in and told him the event was actually long, like really long, he looked up from his book and said, I know, that's why I left. And Tessa said, you didn't even hear the good part. And the argument that followed was so immediate and so comfortable that Callum and Arden sat in the front seat and said nothing and let it run. The driver navigated through evening traffic toward Arden's house, which was where they were having dinner because it was a Thursday. And Thursday had become, over the course of several months, the night they had dinner together, not by formal declaration but by accumulation, the way most of the real things in both their lives had happened. Callum and Arden married the following spring. The ceremony was small, 12 people, a location that was meaningful to them rather than impressive to anyone else. A spring afternoon with weather that was fine, without being spectacular, and which suited the occasion exactly, because it wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. Emmett stood beside Callum and kept adjusting his collar. Tessa stood beside her mother and kept her composure with the seriousness of someone who had decided this was an important job and intended to do it properly. Mrs. Fenwick, the 70-year-old neighbor, cried at a volume that was affectionate and entirely appropriate, and Reuben Tate, who had been invited because he was the closest thing Callum had to a best friend at this point in his life, did not cry but also did not look completely dry-eyed, and Callum chose not to mention it. There were no complications, no emergencies, no last-minute revelations. Life had supplied enough of those in the preceding 18 months, and whatever the universe's accounting system looked like, it seemed to have decided they were current. Harris Talbot's trial concluded 3 weeks later. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and returned on a Thursday morning. Ortega called Callum with the verdict in her level, controlled voice, and Callum was at his desk when the call came and sat for a moment afterward without moving. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to kidnap, conspiracy to commit assault, ordering the mall operation, funding the contractor network. The sentences were consecutive, and they were significant. He would not be a presence in their lives again. Callum put the phone down and looked at his office, the security monitors, the organized desk, the photograph of 6 men in gear that he'd moved from the wooden box in the closet to a frame on the shelf because Emmett had found the box while looking for something else and said, with characteristic directness, you should put this somewhere you can see it. And Callum had thought about it for 3 days and then done it. He looked at the photograph and thought about who those 6 men had been, what they'd done and where they'd done it, and how much of it had never been written down. He thought about the version of himself who had carried that period and then tried to put it entirely down, as if it were possible to separate the man from the years that made him, as if the instincts that had saved Tessa in the food court had arrived from nowhere. They hadn't arrived from nowhere. They'd arrived from a decade of training and field time and the specific education of situations that didn't allow for learning slowly. Those years had a cost that he still carried in physical ways, in the arm that ached in cold weather, in the knee that was slower in the mornings than it used to be, in the scar on his left side that Emmett had noticed at age 7 and asked about and received an honest but incomplete answer. The cost was real, and he owned it. But those years had also made him the person who could look at a man moving through a panicking crowd and understand in 10 seconds what that movement meant. The person who could walk into a security operations center and see what a trained team had missed. The person who could build something, a department, a program, a framework that gave other people with similar histories a way to use what they'd built themselves into. You don't get to choose which parts of your past you keep. You get the whole thing. What you choose is what you do with it. That was the thing he hadn't understood when he'd first packed his service record into a wooden box and pushed it to the back of the closet. He'd thought that moving away from those years meant leaving them behind, sealing them off, becoming someone whose present was defined by something other than his past. What he'd actually done was carry them in a box rather than in his hands, which made them harder to use and no lighter. He didn't know when exactly he'd understood this. It wasn't the mall was when he'd acted on it, but understanding doesn't always arrive before action. Maybe it was Emmett saying, it's okay if you're good at something. Maybe it was Arden looking at a frozen surveillance image and saying, let him work. Maybe it was Claire Addo looking at the ceiling in his office, composing herself after being offered the position because someone had finally offered it. Maybe it was all of those, accumulated. He picked up his phone and called Arden. She answered on the second ring, mid-sentence of something else, the background noise of her day audible through the line. "Talbot," he said. All counts, a beat of silence. He could hear the shift in her, the held breath and the release. "When?" "This morning. Ortega just called." Another pause. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment that had weight to it, not sadness, not relief exactly. Something that was both of those things and a few others that didn't have clean names. He sat with her in it without trying to fill it. "Tell Tessa or wait until she's home," Arden said. "She'll want to know," Callum said. "But how you tell her is your call. You know her better than I do." "I know her differently than you do," Arden said. "Not better." He thought about Tessa in the atrium, auditing the veteran employment program with the systematic clarity of a 10-year-old who wanted to know if things were actually useful or just sounded good. He thought about the note written in careful, uneven handwriting, "My ice cream was ruined." But that's okay in the gravity with which she'd decided that holding Emmett's hand in a panicking food court was something worth thanking him for. "Tell her," he said. "Tell her it's finished." He left the office at 5, which was not always possible and was something he protected when it was. He drove to Emmett's school, picked him up, and they stopped at the hardware store because there was a thing in the kitchen that needed fixing and had been needing fixing for 3 weeks. And Callum had reached the threshold of being able to look at it without deciding to do something about it. Emmett came into the hardware store and had opinions about which kind of sealant was correct, and was wrong about this, but Callum let him make the case because it was a good argument even if it was wrong. They got home. Callum fixed the kitchen thing. Emmett did homework at the table and complained about it at a volume and frequency that suggested the homework was unreasonable, which was his consistent position on homework as an institution. Arden and Tessa arrived at 6:30 because Thursday. Dinner was loud and ordinary, and slightly chaotic in the way that 4 people in a kitchen are always slightly chaotic when 2 of them are children with opinions about the correct way to set a table. Tessa set it her way. Emmett reset the parts he disagreed with. Tessa moved them back. Callum and Arden stood at the counter and did not intervene and made eye contact once with the shared understanding of 2 people who have accepted that some things are not worth arbitrating. After dinner, Emmett and Tessa disappeared to the living room, and the particular sound of their argument about something on television drifted through the apartment with comfortable rhythm of a thing that had been happening long enough to have its own texture. Arden sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and the aftermath of a long day visible in the set of her shoulders and the way she was simply sitting, not organizing or planning or managing anything. Callum sat across from her. "She took it okay," he said, meaning Tessa, meaning Talbot. "She asked 2 very specific questions," Arden said. "She asked if he was going to be in jail for a long time, and I said yes. She asked if he could hire anyone else, and I said no. The people who worked for him were also in custody, or had turned on each other." Arden paused. Then she said okay and went back to what she was doing. "That's Tessa," Callum said. "That's pause. She also asked if you were the one who figured out how to stop him. Not the police. You specifically. What did you tell her?" "I told her that you were part of it." Arden met his eyes. "She said she knew that from the beginning. That you were the kind of person who figures things out." She held his gaze. "She's not wrong." From the living room, Emmett said something with the particular emphasis of someone who has just made a point he considers unanswerable, and Tessa's response was immediate and had the sound of someone preparing a second argument, and Callum listened to the 2 of them his son. This girl who had become something he hadn't expected and couldn't name with a single word, and thought about yellow dresses and melting ice cream and a food court floor and the 6 seconds it had taken to cross it. He thought about what those 6 seconds had cost the arm, the stitches, the 2 weeks of pulled shifts, the entire disruption of a life that had been stable in its own limited way, and whether, knowing all of it, he'd do it again. That wasn't even a question. The real question was the one nobody had asked him directly, and that he'd been answering in installments over the past 18 months, without articulating it to himself. What do you do when the thing you ran toward turns out to be not just a child in danger, but an entirely different version of your life? What do you do when the split-second decision opens a door you didn't know you were standing in front of? You walk through it. Not because it's easy, not because what's on the other side is uncomplicated or perfectly arranged, but because some doors only open once, and standing in front of a closed door because you're afraid of what walking through it will cost you is its own kind of loss, slower, quieter, but real. He had spent years hiding the man he'd been because he thought that was the price of becoming the man he wanted to be. What he understood now was that the two men were the same man, and hiding one half from the other was just a way of walking through the world at half capacity, carrying twice the weight. He was tired of carrying things he didn't have to carry. Arden was watching him with the look she got sometimes when she could see him thinking and had decided not to interrupt it. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You just get very quiet when something resolves. Does that bother you?" "No," she said. "It's one of about 400 things I've gotten used to." She said it with the flat affection of someone who is not performing warmth, but simply has it, the real kind, the kind built from proximity and time, and seeing the actual person rather than the idea of them. 400, he said. Conservatively, she said. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his without looking at it, the way you do things, with people when you've been doing them, long enough that they don't require attention to locate. From the living room, both children had apparently united around something on the television, because the arguing had stopped and been replaced by the sound of two kids watching something together, commentary running between them in the easy, overlapping way of people who have figured out each other's rhythms. Callum and Arden sat in the kitchen and listened to that, and neither of them said anything, and it was the best kind of quiet, the kind that isn't empty, the kind that comes from a life with enough people in it to fill the spaces that used to only hold silence. Outside, the city went about its Thursday evening, indifferent and continuous and full of its own small urgencies. Inside, the four of them occupied the ordinary space of a Thursday night, in a life that had been built from a single moment that lasted 6 seconds and a decision that cost nothing and everything at once. It wasn't a perfect life. It was never going to be a perfect life. It was real, and it was theirs, and that was the thing that actually mattered, the only thing. When you stripped everything else away, that had ever mattered at all.